On September 27, 1940, a British officer led a night raid against German positions near the village of El Epinette in northern France. The operation was part of a broader reconnaissance effort by small commando units operating along the occupied French coast. What made this particular raid notable was not its strategic significance, which was minimal, but rather the manner in which it was conducted. The officer, Lieutenant John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill of the Manchester Regiment, carried a military longbow and a quiver of arrows. During the engagement, as his unit approached a German outpost, Churchill drew his bow and shot a German soldier through the chest with a barbed arrow. The man died almost instantly. This action is documented as the only confirmed kill with a longbow by a British soldier during the Second World War, and it established the foundation for a legend that would follow Churchill through the remainder of the conflict and into the decades beyond. John Churchill was born on September 16, 1906, in Colombo, Ceylon, which is present-day Sri Lanka. His father, Alec Fleming Churchill, was a civil engineer working for the Ceylon Government Railway, part of the administrative apparatus of the British Empire that connected distant territories through infrastructure and bureaucracy. The family returned to England when John was young, and he was educated at King William's College on the Isle of Man, a boarding school that emphasized discipline, physical fitness, and the values of service that characterized British education in the early 20th century. Churchill was not related to Winston Churchill, a fact that required clarification throughout his life, though he shared with the more famous Churchill a certain flair for dramatic action and an indifference to conventional military thinking. After completing his education, Churchill attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, the institution that had trained British Army officers since the early 19th century. He graduated in 1926 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. His early military career was unremarkable by the standards of the peacetime army. He served in Burma, where the British maintained colonial garrisons tasked with maintaining order and conducting occasional operations against insurgent groups in the remote hill regions. The work was routine, punctuated by long periods of garrison duty, ceremonial functions, and the social activities that occupied officers stationed far from home. Churchill proved competent in these duties but showed no particular distinction that might have predicted his later unconventional approach to warfare. What did distinguish Churchill during these early years was his interest in activities outside the normal range of military service. He learned to play the bagpipes, an instrument associated with Scottish regiments but not typically practiced by officers of English units. He also developed an interest in archery, not merely as a recreational activity but as a serious discipline requiring strength, precision, and consistent practice. These interests were unusual but not unprecedented among British officers, who were expected to cultivate hobbies that demonstrated both physical capability and cultural refinement. Churchill took these hobbies seriously, practicing regularly, and eventually achieving a level of proficiency that placed him among the better archers in England during the 1930s. In 1936, Churchill represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships held in Oslo, Norway. He did not win the competition, but his participation demonstrated that his interest in archery extended beyond casual recreation. The following year, he left the British Army. His resignation from military service coincided with a period when many young officers were finding the peacetime army unstimulating and poorly paid. Churchill sought opportunities in civilian life, working briefly as a newspaper editor and then as a male model, an unusual occupation for a former military officer but one that provided income during the uncertain economic conditions of the late 1930s. He also appeared as an extra in several films, including a notable appearance in the 1939 film The Thief of Baghdad, where he played a soldier. These activities placed him far from the conventional career path of a professional officer, and there was little indication that he would return to military service, much less distinguish himself in combat. The outbreak of war in September 1939 changed these calculations for thousands of men who had left military service during the interwar years. Churchill, like many former officers, was recalled to the colours and recommissioned into the Manchester Regiment with the rank of lieutenant. He was initially assigned to training duties in England, a role that made use of his previous experience but offered little opportunity for the kind of action that wars are remembered for. The British Expeditionary Force was deployed to France, and Churchill, eager to see active service, requested a transfer to a unit scheduled for deployment to the continent. His request was approved, and he joined his regiment in France in early 1940 as part of the defensive forces arrayed along the French-Belgian border, waiting for the German offensive that military intelligence suggested was inevitable but whose timing and direction remained uncertain. The German assault began on May 10, 1940, with a massive offensive through the Low Countries that bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line and struck through the Ardennes Forest, an area the French military had considered impassable for large armoured formations. The speed and violence of the German advance shattered Allied defensive plans, and within days, British and French forces were in retreat, attempting to establish defensive positions that might slow the German advance long enough to organise a coherent response. Churchill's regiment was part of the forces deployed to cover the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk, an operation that began in late May and continued into early June. During this chaotic period, Churchill led patrols and reconnaissance missions, and it was during one of these operations that he first carried his Scottish broadsword into combat, a weapon he had acquired privately and which was not part of standard British Army equipment. The evacuation from Dunkirk concluded on June 4th, and Churchill returned to England along with hundreds of thousands of other soldiers who had been extracted from the collapsing front. The British Army had survived but had left behind most of its heavy equipment, and the immediate priority was reorganisation and re-equipment. Churchill, now promoted to captain, was assigned to various temporary duties while the army sorted itself out. It was during this period that he volunteered for the newly formed commando units, special forces organizations created to conduct raids against German-occupied territory. The commandos represented a significant departure from conventional military structure, emphasizing small unit operations, individual initiative, and aggressive action. Churchill's combination of regular army experience and unconventional interests made him a suitable candidate for this new type of warfare. The commando training program was physically demanding and designed to identify men capable of operating independently under difficult conditions. Training took place in Scotland, where the terrain provided realistic conditions for amphibious landings, mountain warfare, and survival in harsh weather. Churchill thrived in this environment. His bagpipes, which he had continued to play throughout his military service, became a fixture of commando training camps, and he would often play marches before operations, a practice that some found inspiring and others merely eccentric. He also continued to carry his broadsword and longbow, weapons that senior officers tolerated because Churchill had demonstrated competence in conventional infantry skills and leadership. By late 1940, Churchill had been assigned to No. 3 Commando, one of several such units being prepared for operations against German positions in occupied Europe. The raid near Epinette in September 1940 was Churchill's first commando operation. The mission was small-scale, involving a landing on the French coast under cover of darkness, reconnaissance of German positions, and withdrawal before German reinforcements could respond. Churchill led a section of approximately 10 men, and the operation proceeded according to plan until the unit encountered a German sentry post. Churchill, who was carrying his longbow along with standard infantry weapons, chose to engage the sentries with the bow rather than firearms, which would have created noise and potentially alerted other German units in the area. The arrow struck its target, and the German soldier fell without having fired a weapon. The commandos completed their reconnaissance and withdrew to their boats, returning to England without casualties. The incident was documented in after-action reports, though it received limited attention at the time because the strategic value of the raid was minimal, and because the British military was conducting numerous similar operations along the occupied coast. Churchill's use of the longbow was not mere theatricality, though it certainly had theatrical elements. In the context of commando operations, where surprise and silence were often more valuable than firepower, a weapon that killed without noise had genuine tactical utility. The longbow was also reliable in conditions where firearms might malfunction, required no ammunition beyond arrows that could be recovered and reused, and demonstrated a level of personal skill that reinforced Churchill's authority with his men. That said, Churchill also carried standard firearms and used them when appropriate. His choice of weapons was flexible and context-dependent, not the action of someone who rejected modern warfare but rather someone who understood that different situations called for different tools. In December 1941, Churchill participated in Operation Archery, a large-scale commando raid against German positions in WWII GSY, Norway. The operation involved over 500 commandos supported by naval gunfire and air cover, with the objective of destroying German installations, capturing prisoners, and demonstrating British offensive capability in occupied territory. Churchill led a unit ashore during the initial assault, and according to multiple witness accounts, he jumped from a landing craft playing March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes, then transitioned to leading his men in an attack on German fortifications with his broadsword drawn. The operation was successful in achieving its tactical objectives, though it resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Churchill's unit captured several German soldiers, destroyed a fish oil factory that had been producing glycerin for German explosives, and withdrew after approximately 6 hours of combat. The VA with Ring Above GSY raid established Churchill's reputation within the commando community as an officer who combined effective leadership with a highly individual approach to combat. Fellow officers noted that Churchill's eccentric weapons and theatrical gestures did not diminish his tactical competence. He understood small unit tactics, moved his men efficiently under fire, and demonstrated the kind of aggressive leadership that commando operations required. His men followed him, which is the ultimate measure of military leadership, and they followed him into situations where the risk of death or capture was substantial. The bagpipes and broadsword were distinctive, but they were accompaniments to professional military skill, not substitutes for it. In July 1943, Churchill, now a major and second in command of No. 2 Commando, participated in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The operation was one of the largest amphibious assaults conducted to that point in the war, involving multiple divisions landing on the southern coast of Sicily with the objective of establishing a foothold from which Allied forces could advance into mainland Europe. Churchill's commando unit was assigned to capture specific coastal positions ahead of the main invasion force, securing bridges and road junctions that would facilitate the advance inland. The landing took place in darkness, and Churchill's unit came ashore under German artillery fire. Churchill, again carrying his broadsword and accompanied by a soldier carrying his bagpipes when he was not playing them himself, led his men in an assault on German positions near the town of Catania. The fighting in Sicily was intense and sustained. German forces, supported by Italian units, conducted a fighting withdrawal that contested every defensive position. Churchill's commandos operated as part of the broader Allied advance, clearing strongpoints, conducting reconnaissance, and engaging German rearguards. In one documented incident, Churchill and a single corporal captured a German observation post by approaching it at night and forcing the surrender of 42 German soldiers. Churchill later stated that the German soldiers were convinced they were surrounded by a much larger force, a conclusion Churchill encouraged by bluffing about the size of his unit and presenting himself with sufficient confidence that the Germans chose surrender over continued resistance. The incident illustrated Churchill's understanding of psychological warfare and his willingness to take calculated risks that conventional officers might have avoided. After Sicily, Allied forces prepared for the invasion of mainland Italy. Churchill's unit participated in the landings at Salerno in September 1943, another large-scale amphibious operation that encountered fierce German resistance. The landing beaches came under intense artillery and mortar fire, and several Allied units struggled to advance beyond the immediate coastal areas. Churchill's commandos were tasked with seizing high ground overlooking the beaches, positions that German forces were using to direct artillery fire onto the landing zones. The assault required crossing open ground under fire, a situation where casualties were almost inevitable. Churchill led from the front, a leadership style that exposed him to the same risks as his men but also provided the kind of visible example that kept units moving when instinct suggested taking cover. During subsequent operations in Italy, Churchill participated in actions along the Salerno beachhead and later in the fighting around Monte Cassino, though his unit was not directly involved in the most intense combat around the monastery itself. The Italian campaign was characterized by difficult terrain, well-prepared German defensive positions, and weather that alternated between heat and rain depending on the season. Commando units were used for specific tactical objectives rather than extended frontline duty, and Churchill's unit conducted raids, captured prisoners for intelligence purposes, and cleared strongpoints that were impeding the advance of larger formations. Throughout this period, Churchill maintained his practice of carrying his broadsword and playing his bagpipes before operations, behaviors that had become his signature within the commando community and which were documented in numerous accounts by soldiers who served with him. In May 1944, Churchill and his commando unit were deployed to Yugoslavia to support partisan forces fighting against German occupation. The mission involved landing on German-held islands in the Adriatic Sea, conducting raids, and coordinating with Yugoslav partisans who were conducting guerrilla operations in the interior. Churchill commanded a force operating on the island of Bra, where his unit established contact with local resistance fighters and organized attacks on German positions. The situation in Yugoslavia was complex, with multiple resistance groups operating, sometimes in cooperation and sometimes in conflict with each other, and German forces conducting brutal counterinsurgency operations. Churchill's role was to provide military expertise and coordinate partisan actions with broader Allied strategic objectives. On May 29, 1944, Churchill's force was ambushed by German troops during an operation on the island. The engagement began with mortar fire that killed or wounded several of Churchill's men, followed by a German infantry assault that overran the commando positions. Churchill, wounded by shrapnel and disoriented by the explosion, was captured along with several other survivors. He was initially held at a local detention facility and then transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. The capture of a British commando officer with Churchill's reputation was considered significant by German intelligence, and he was interrogated extensively about commando operations, training methods, and future Allied plans. Churchill provided only his name, rank, and service number, the minimum information required under the Geneva Convention, and refused to cooperate with German intelligence efforts. Churchill was held at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located north of Berlin. The camp was primarily a detention facility for political prisoners and captured resistance fighters, not a conventional prisoner of war camp, and conditions were significantly harsher than those mandated by international law for military prisoners. Churchill was confined with other prisoners designated as particularly dangerous or valuable for intelligence purposes. Despite the conditions, Churchill immediately began planning an escape. In September 1944, he and a Royal Air Force officer managed to escape from Sachsenhausen by crawling under the wire during a period when guards were distracted by an air raid. The two men traveled on foot through German territory, attempting to reach the Baltic coast where they hoped to steal a boat and reach neutral Sweden. The escape attempt was partially successful. Churchill and his companion evaded capture for several days, traveling at night and hiding during daylight hours. They survived on food stolen from farms and vegetables taken from gardens, moving generally northward through the German countryside. However, the distance to the Baltic coast was greater than they had estimated, and German security forces, alerted to the escape, were conducting widespread searches. Churchill was recaptured near the coastal town of Rostock, approximately 100 miles from Sachsenhausen. He was returned to custody, beaten by guards in retaliation for the escape, and transferred to a different facility with enhanced security. Churchill's next place of confinement was a prisoner of war camp in Austria, located in the mountainous region near the town of Markt-Pongau. The camp held several hundred Allied prisoners, primarily officers, and was administered according to Geneva Convention standards, which meant better conditions than Sachsenhausen but also more systematic surveillance. Churchill, undeterred by his previous failed escape, began planning another attempt. In April 1945, with the war clearly entering its final phase and German forces in disarray, Churchill and a group of other prisoners walked out of the camp during a confusion caused by the departure of German guards, who were abandoning their posts as American forces approached the area. This time, the escape was successful. Churchill walked for approximately 100 miles through the Austrian Alps until he encountered American armored units advancing eastward. He was repatriated to Allied control, processed through military channels, and eventually returned to England. Churchill arrived back in England in May 1945, after the German surrender but before the conclusion of the war against Japan. He immediately requested reassignment to a combat unit, preferably one deploying to the Pacific Theater where fighting continued. His request was approved, and he was assigned to a unit preparing for operations in Burma, where British and Commonwealth forces were conducting campaigns against Japanese forces in difficult jungle terrain. Churchill underwent brief retraining for jungle warfare, a significant change from the European combat environment where he had operated for the previous 5 years. However, before Churchill's unit could deploy, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Churchill, learning of the surrender, reportedly remarked that if it were not for the Americans and their atomic weapons, the war could have continued for another 10 years, a comment that reflected frustration rather than serious strategic analysis but which illustrated his appetite for combat. With the war concluded, Churchill faced the same question confronting millions of servicemen: what to do in peacetime. The British military was rapidly demobilizing, reducing in size from its wartime peak to a peacetime establishment that was a fraction of its previous strength. Churchill remained in uniform and was posted to various assignments that made use of his experience. In 1946, he was sent to British-controlled Palestine, where the military was attempting to maintain order amid increasing tensions between Jewish and Arab populations and growing violence directed at British forces by groups seeking to end the British mandate. Churchill served as an instructor at a training facility, teaching tactics and small unit operations to junior officers. The work was professional but lacked the intensity and clear purpose that had characterized his wartime service. Churchill also qualified as a parachutist during this period, completing jump training at the age of 40, an age when most military personnel were considered too old for airborne operations. He was subsequently assigned to airborne units and participated in training exercises, though he never conducted a combat parachute jump. His interest in acquiring new military skills continued throughout his post-war career, demonstrating that his unconventional approach to soldiering was not limited to carrying unusual weapons but extended to a broader willingness to engage with military challenges regardless of whether they fit conventional career progression patterns. In 1948, Churchill transitioned to a staff position, and over the following years, he served in various administrative and training roles. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, a rank that reflected his experience and time in service rather than any particular achievement in post-war assignments. The peacetime army offered limited opportunities for the kind of active combat leadership that had defined his wartime experience, and Churchill, like many combat veterans, struggled to find satisfaction in garrison duty and bureaucratic responsibilities. He spent time in Australia, where he served as an instructor at a military college, and later returned to England for additional assignments. In 1959, at the age of 53, he retired from the British Army after more than 30 years of service, both in peacetime and war. Churchill's retirement was not a withdrawal from physical activity or adventure. He took up surfing, an unusual hobby for a man in his 50s but consistent with his lifelong pattern of pursuing activities that combined physical challenge with a degree of eccentricity. He learned to surf on beaches in southern England and became competent enough to be recognized by the surfing community that was beginning to develop in Britain during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He also continued to play the bagpipes and maintain his interest in archery, though at a less competitive level than during his younger years. He lived quietly in Surrey with his wife, Rosamond, whom he had married in 1941, and their 2 sons. The family life was conventional, a marked contrast to the dramatic episodes of his military career. Churchill's wartime exploits gradually became known beyond military circles as historians and journalists began documenting unusual stories from the Second World War. His use of the longbow and broadsword, which had been noted in official reports but not widely publicized during the war itself, attracted attention as examples of individual eccentricity within the larger machinery of modern warfare. Newspaper articles and magazine features profiled Churchill, often emphasizing the theatrical aspects of his service, while sometimes overlooking the genuine military competence that had made his unconventional approach effective. Churchill gave occasional interviews, generally preferring to downplay the more sensational elements of his story and emphasizing that his actions had been consistent with his understanding of effective military leadership, not merely attempts to be different for its own sake. In these interviews, Churchill articulated a philosophy of combat that emphasized personal example and the importance of morale. He believed that soldiers fought more effectively when led by officers who shared their risks and who demonstrated confidence even in dangerous situations. The bagpipes, in his view, served to focus the attention of his men and signal that an operation was beginning, creating a psychological transition from waiting to action. The broadsword was less practically useful but served as a visible symbol of his personal commitment to the fight, a signal that he was not directing operations from a safe distance but was present at the point of contact. Churchill understood that modern warfare was fundamentally about firepower, logistics, and coordination, but he also believed that individual actions and symbols still mattered within that framework. Churchill's story was also incorporated into broader narratives about British military history and national character. The image of a British officer charging into battle with medieval weapons while modern warfare raged around him appealed to certain ideas about British eccentricity and the ability of individuals to maintain personal style even within large military organizations. This narrative was not entirely accurate, as Churchill's actions were not typical of British officers and were sometimes viewed with skepticism by his superiors, but it resonated with post-war audiences looking for stories that combined heroism with human interest. Churchill became a minor celebrity, recognized in certain circles and occasionally invited to speak at military events and reunions. The historical assessment of Churchill's military career requires distinguishing between the dramatic surface elements and the underlying substance. Churchill was an effective combat officer who led men successfully in multiple operations across different theaters of war. His record included successful raids, effective small unit leadership, and the ability to maintain unit cohesion under difficult conditions. These achievements would have been notable even if he had carried only standard military equipment. The longbow, bagpipes, and broadsword were additions to this foundation of professional competence, not substitutes for it. They made Churchill memorable, but they were not what made him effective. At the same time, Churchill's willingness to deviate from standard military practice reflected a personality type that military organizations both need and struggle to accommodate. Effective military operations require discipline, standardization, and adherence to established procedures, but they also require initiative, adaptability, and the ability to make decisions in uncertain situations. Churchill represented the latter qualities in an extreme form, and his success in combat validated his approach, at least within the specific context of commando operations where individual initiative was valued more highly than in conventional units. Whether his methods would have been equally effective in a different military context is unclear, and it is notable that Churchill's most celebrated actions occurred in special forces units rather than in conventional infantry formations. Churchill lived into his 90s, dying on March 8, 1996, in Surrey at the age of 89. His obituaries in British newspapers noted his unusual approach to warfare and his survival through some of the most intense combat operations of the Second World War. His death occurred more than 50 years after the end of the war he was most famous for, a distance in time that had transformed the conflict from lived experience into history. The weapons he had carried into combat were donated to museums, where they became artifacts illustrating a particular kind of martial eccentricity. The longbow that had killed a German soldier in 1940 was preserved as a curiosity, a weapon from an earlier age of warfare used in an era of machine guns and artillery. The historical record of Churchill's service is well documented in military archives, unit histories, and the memoirs of soldiers who served with him. These sources confirm the basic facts of his story, while also providing context that is sometimes missing from popular retellings. Churchill was one of thousands of British officers who led commando raids during the Second World War, most of whom are now forgotten except in specialized military histories. His distinction lay not in being the only effective commando officer, but in being the one who approached the role with a combination of competence and individual style that made his story memorable. The longbow and broadsword were real, as were the bagpipes and the documented combat actions, but they existed within the larger framework of military operations that were fundamentally about objectives, tactics, and the coordination of force. The question of whether Churchill's unconventional approach to warfare offers broader lessons is complicated. On one hand, his story demonstrates that military effectiveness can accommodate individual variation, and that leadership sometimes benefits from dramatic gestures that capture attention and build morale. On the other hand, Churchill's methods were specific to his personality, the units he served in, and the historical moment in which he operated. Attempting to replicate his approach in different circumstances might produce very different results. The British commandos of the Second World War were elite units operating in situations where conventional military doctrine was insufficient, and they were granted latitude to experiment with tactics and approaches that would not have been tolerated in regular formations. Churchill thrived in this environment, but it is not clear his methods would have been effective or even permitted in a conventional infantry battalion. What is clear is that Churchill's story has persisted in popular memory in ways that stories of more conventionally successful officers have not. This persistence reflects something about how military history is remembered and transmitted. The technical details of operations, the logistics of amphibious landings, and the coordination of artillery support are essential to understanding how wars are actually fought, but they do not generate memorable narratives. Individual actions, distinctive personalities, and unusual details do generate such narratives, and Churchill's story contains all of these elements. The longbow kill in 1940 is historically minor, affecting the outcome of neither the raid nor the broader war, but it is memorable in ways that more strategically significant actions are not. Churchill himself seemed to understand this dynamic. In his later years, he was willing to discuss his wartime experiences but generally avoided claiming that his methods represented some profound insight into warfare. He had been a soldier doing his job in the manner that seemed most effective to him at the time. The weapons he carried were choices based on his assessment of what would work in specific situations, not statements of military philosophy. The fact that these choices seemed unusual to others was, from his perspective, less important than the fact that they had contributed to mission success. He had survived the war, led his men effectively, and accomplished the objectives assigned to him. The rest was interpretation by others, and Churchill was content to let historians and journalists make of his story what they would. The broader significance of Churchill's military career lies in what it reveals about the relationship between individual personality and institutional structures. Military organizations, particularly during wartime, must balance the need for discipline and standardization against the reality that combat requires individual initiative and adaptation. Officers who succeed in combat often do so by finding ways to express their individual judgment within the constraints of military hierarchy and doctrine. Churchill found such a way, using weapons and gestures that were outside the standard military repertoire but which did not fundamentally challenge military authority or operational effectiveness. He was tolerated, and eventually celebrated, because he produced results. Had his methods failed or resulted in unnecessary casualties, the same behaviors would likely have been criticized as reckless and unprofessional. In the decades since Churchill's death, his story has been retold in books, documentaries, and online media. each retelling emphasizing different aspects depending on the interests of the audience and the narrator. Some versions focus on the comedy of a man bringing medieval weapons to modern warfare, treating the story as an amusing historical anecdote. Other versions emphasize Churchill's courage and leadership, using his story as an example of martial virtue. Still others analyze him as a case study in military psychology or leadership theory. Each of these interpretations captures part of the reality, but none captures it completely. Churchill was simultaneously courageous and eccentric, effective and unusual, serious about his military responsibilities and willing to approach them in ways that seemed theatrical to observers. The physical artifacts of Churchill's military service remain in museum collections. The broadsword he carried into combat is displayed at a military museum, labeled with text explaining its use during the Second World War. The longbow, if it still exists, is similarly preserved as a historical curiosity. These objects are material evidence that the story is not merely legend or exaggeration, that a British officer genuinely did carry such weapons into modern combat. They are also reminders of how individual choices within large historical events can create narratives that persist long after the events themselves have receded into the past. The broadsword did not change the outcome of the war, but it changed how one participant's experience of that war is remembered. Churchill's legacy within British military culture is ambiguous. He is remembered with a mixture of admiration and amusement, celebrated for his courage but also viewed as an outlier whose methods would not be recommended for general adoption. Military training programs do not teach officers to carry longbows, and Churchill's story is not presented as a model for professional development. Instead, it exists as one of many colourful episodes in the broader history of British military operations, a story that illustrates the diversity of human responses to the extreme circumstances of war. For some, Churchill represents the best of British military tradition, bravery, initiative, and a refusal to be constrained by convention. For others, he represents an eccentricity that was tolerated because of unusual circumstances but which should not be mistaken for a sustainable approach to military leadership. The question of whether Churchill was mad, as his nickname suggested, or simply unconventional is ultimately unanswerable because it depends on definitions that are subjective and context-dependent. He was certainly unusual by the standards of military conformity, but his actions were not irrational or disconnected from military objectives. He assessed situations, made decisions, and executed plans that achieved results. The means he chose were distinctive, but the ends were entirely conventional, completing missions, protecting his men, and defeating the enemy. If this constitutes madness, it is a highly functional form of it, and one that military organizations found useful even if they did not entirely understand or approve of it. In the end, John Churchill's story is preserved in historical records, museum collections, and the memories of the diminishing number of people who served with him or knew him personally. The story has been simplified and mythologized in some retellings, stripped of context and reduced to colorful anecdotes about bagpipes and broadswords. But the documentary evidence confirms that beneath the mythology is a genuine historical figure who served effectively in one of the 20th century's defining conflicts, who survived capture and imprisonment, and who approached military service with a combination of professionalism and individuality that made his experience distinct from that of the millions of other men who wore British uniforms during the Second World War. His story endures not because it is typical but because it is not, and because it offers a reminder that even within the mechanized, standardized warfare of the modern era, there remains space for human variation and individual expression. Churchill found that space and occupied it fully, and in doing so, he created a historical narrative that continues to fascinate more than 75 years after the events it describes.